Okay, I'm excited to show you Dresden 4. I know you're not supposed to have favorite children, but this is my favorite Dresden block. This is 4 of them made in the 7-inch size, and we are going to be doing the 8-inch size for our video. Throw this over here. And here's your instructions for your Dresden 4. This is where it will be in the mystery quilt. So it's kind of coming together, so hopefully you can kind of see something forming. This is pretty cool if you want to, if I was going to make a Dresden, I think I'd probably jump on board with Dresden 4 and making a one block wonder out of that one. So here is our Dresden 4, the first page. Our second page of the instructions. As you can see, we're going to do the 8-inch blocks for this video, so that's why I have that circled. And we're going to be doing it in a blue and white quilt. So we did black and white on Dresden 3, which kind of looks kind of modern and masculine, or this kind of has the opposite. Even though it's still a 2-color quilt, it's going to be very feminine looking and very traditional looking with those colors, but a very non-traditional Dresden shape. So I have all my stuff ready to go. I have my battleizer in the hoop. We're going to do the wool batting option, so I have that ready to go with the edges pressed in about 1/4 of an inch. I have my fabric 1, my fabric 2, my fabric 3, my fabric 4. The white again will be our backing fabric, and we need a little square of white backing fabric as well. And then also this is our, this was background. This is our backing fabric. And this is our quilting thread, our thread A with the bobbin, and both of those have a bobbin, our thread B, our thread C with a bobbin, and our thread D. So let's get started stitching Dresden 4. Okay, for step number 1, I have my battleizer in the hoop, and I have just a neutral thread, so I chose just one of the lighter blue colors. And we're going to have the machine stitch a placement stitch so we know where to put our wool batting. Alright, we're ready for step 2. We have our placement stitch sewn out, and like I said, I use the blue thread, any kind of neutral thread, or you can just begin with the water soluble thread. Generally that's what I do, but for the video and picture purposes, it's nice for you guys to be able to see. That's why I chose to use that blue. But a water soluble thread, so you have less thread changes. That's always a welcome thing. So then we're going to just lay our wool batting right inside that placement stitch. And again, if you choose to not use the wool batting and just use the battleizer, just go ahead and skip to step 3. But in step 2, it's going to stitch a zigzag stitch using that water soluble thread. And the reason we use the water soluble thread is just so there's less bulk, and that will eventually wash out. Okay, for step 3, we're going to continue with the water soluble thread, and we're going to take our backing fabric, our background fabric, and we're going to center it over this area and let the machine sew a tack down stitch. Okay, for step 4, I have thread A in the needle only, and we're going to sew the cross stitch. For step 5, I have water soluble thread in the needle only, and it's going to sew a placement stitch. There's our placement stitch. For step 6, we're going to take fabric 1 and we're going to place it right side up over that placement stitch. And you're going to want to extend about 1/4 of an inch past this area here, since that's going to be the next seam allowance. And make sure that your fabric extends beyond that point there. So let me get it placed where it needs to be. And with the water soluble thread, we'll sew the tack down stitch. Okay, so now it's time to trim our fabric 1 that we put on here. And we're going to trim, since it did a double stitch here, it also, if you notice while it was stitching, it double stitched right there. So we are going to trim close to stitching right here and right there. And just kind of, I think this will help you get the visual on it, is that this block, this is this block right here, oriented the same way, and it has this little area here. So since this needs to be turned up close to the stitching because of how that jagged edge goes out, and it'll be the same way with each and every one of the pieces of fabric that we add. So we'll trim close to stitching right here and also right here. Leave at least in 1/2 inch on the outside of the block, and here you can trim this close, probably up to about 1/8 of an inch. Here is that fabric all trimmed up, and for step 7 I have my fabric 2, and I'm going to lay it right side down, raw edges even with this area right here. I move it down a little bit because I still have the selvage on here. And very important thing, I have changed from my water soluble thread to a neutral thread, so I just put a white thread in there. And now we're going to let the machine sew that seam. And for step 8, I'm going to leave that white thread in there, or the neutral thread. I'm going to flip my fabric 2 right side up, and I'm going to finger press, and the machine will sew a tack down stitch. And now step 9, we have our fabric 3, and we're going to turn it right side down so that the right sides are together with the last piece of fabric we pieced on here. And using the neutral thread, we're going to stitch another seam. Step 10, we're going to flip our fabric 3 right side up. I'm bringing it forward a little bit so you can see it. We flipped it right side up, and then we're going to finger press and let the machine sew a tack down stitch, and we're going to continue that step using the neutral thread. Now this is starting to remind me of Grandma's blue willow dishes. For step 11, you're going to take your fabric 4 right side down with the raw edges even, and the machine will stitch a seam using that neutral thread. Okay, now before we go to step 12 and sew that, we're going to change to our water soluble thread, and that is because we are now stitching on the edge of the block. And when we sew all our blocks together, if there's any thread that happens to be showing, we know if we use water soluble that it can just be washed out. So let me get this thread in here, and I'm going to bring it forward so you can see it. Just like before, I'm flipping that fabric right side up. I'm going to finger press the seam, and the machine with the water soluble thread will sew the tack down stitch. And the trimming on the edge of the block, you're going to trim about 1/8 of an inch on the bottom side here. We're going to leave, just like we did here, at least 1/2 inch of fabric. And at the top edge, we're going to trim right up to the stitching. All right. Step 13, we have a small square of our background fabric, and we're going to lay it right down here in the corner. I already have my water soluble thread in there, so we're going to go ahead and stitch that down using the water soluble thread. And now I'm going to trim it right up to the stitching on this inside curved edge, and whatever is on the outside, I'm going to just leave that there. Here is step 13 all trimmed up, and for step 14 I have my thread D in the needle only, and it's going to stitch some embroidery. For step 15, I have thread B in the needle only, and it's going to stitch a satin cover stitch around the raw edge. For step 16, we're going to place our quilting thread in the needle only. We're going to sew a satin cover stitch right there. Okay, for step 17, you're going to put your water-soluble thread in the needle only. You're going to have your backing fabric, and you can spray the back with water soluble spray adhesive if you want to. And then you're going to center it over the back. And make sure it's nice and smooth and it's kind of sticking to it so you don't have any Dunlops. Then you're going to place your hoop back on your machine and peek under there just to make sure that it didn't flip over before you begin sewing the basting stitch. So now I'll hit the start button and we'll sew the basting stitch onto the back of the block using the water soluble thread. Now we have our backing fabric basted on there, and now that our back is on here, don't forget the two golden hoop sisters rules that you have to match your needle and bobbin thread, and you need to bring that bobbin thread up through the top of the block before you begin stitching. And also keep in mind that you also need to, if you have an automatic thread cutter on your machine, make sure it's turned off at this point. These are some tips that will help you have a much prettier, neater looking back to your block. So I have my thread A in the needle as well as in the bobbin. And we're going to stitch some quilting, bringing the needle thread, bobbin thread up through the block, and then we can begin stitching. For step 19, you're going to put thread C in the needle as well as the bobbin. Bring the bobbin thread to the top, and then begin stitching, and it's going to sew some quilting. For step 20, you're going to have your quilting thread and the needle end in the bobbin, and we're going to stitch the quilting. First, we're going to bring that bobbin thread up through the top and begin quilting. So here's my Dresden 4 all completed, and I'm going to trim all four sides as though there's going to be another block joined to it. So here's my trimmer by George with my metal and crimped metal edge, and I'm going to just slide that right underneath the fabric on the front between that and the battleizer. And then with the 60mm rotary cutter, I'll use that straight edge to cut it all the way. And there you can see the only thing left is the fabric on the front, and I will do that to all four sides. This is a beautiful blue block. And now that I have that done, there's further trimming to be done, but you can see what it looks like on the back. And this is just the background fabric from the front that is showing. So now what we need to do is we need to trim it all evenly, the fabric on the front, so it's 1/4 inch from that basting stitch. So all we do is flip that trimmer by George 2.0 upside down, and then we can use the acrylic ruler part of it. And we'll get it all trimmed up nice and neat, and then we'll be able to sew the blocks to each other. So there is our blue sample of our Dresden 4, and let me grab the other one just so you can see it in another colorway. Here are 4 of those Dresden 4s. This is a 7-inch block that are all stitched together. So once you stitch them together, this is what the back looks like, and you have raw edges showing. So later on we'll be showing another video that we'll have available that will show you how to put the sashing strips over the top of the raw edges to complete the block. So there you go. Thanks for watching the video.